I believe we have Kay on the line with a property law question.
Yes. I was wanting to find out. I know someone that bought a piece of property, and they are trying to find the property pins so they can, establish their property lines. It was bought privately, so it wasn't necessarily surveyed recently. So one of the property lines is believed to be within a fence line of one of the neighbors, and nobody wants trouble with their neighbors. So how would one go about finding out where exactly the property pins are so they could possibly put up a fence line without causing a problem?
Okay, that is an excellent question and the perfect question for Brandon, who is my guest tonight because he practices in this type of law.
Yeah, Kay, that's a great question, and that is the epitome of why you hire a surveyor. So a surveyor will come out and they will look at the deed that you have for your property, and they'll take what's called the legal description, which has a bunch of meets and bounds on it and what are called calls, and make sense of that stuff. And they'll literally go out and they'll put those little flags at the corners of your properties and they'll mark out where those boundary lines are. Oftentimes, there's actually rods that are buried by the initial developer where they can go take a metal detector and detect where those rods are and then put the flags right there. And then once you have the flags in place, sometimes they'll put string on the lines just to make it clear. Sometimes you can just see it with your eye and see what the line is. And at that point, once you have the line for certain, then you can make sure that the fence gets put up on the proper side of the line. Or if there's already a fence there, you can start looking at whether or not that fence is on the right side of the line. And if for some reason it's on the wrong side, that's when you can just start discussing, hopefully in a civil fashion with your neighbor, hey, I might need an easement, or maybe I can buy a little bit of land from you, or you need to buy some land from me, and try to resolve that as, good neighbors sort of trying to get into some kind of dispute or taking down fences or something along those lines. But that's a fantastic question and exactly what a surveyor is used for.
So the starting point there is to get a surveyor so you make sure you're putting the fence on the correct part of the property so there's no disputes down the road?
Absolutely, absolutely, and yes.
Okay. Kay, that was a great question. I would say most of the time, I know this is in my job, but probably happens a lot in yours, people try to resolve something on their own, whether it's with an insurance company or with a neighbor. But a lot of times people just get so frustrated that they're not getting any sort of resolution. Is there any sort of recommendation where you say, try to resolve it yourself first before coming to an attorney, or, as soon as you have an issue, come to an attorney?
Honestly, Brian, I say it's a mixture. I really try to encourage neighbors to be good neighbors. A lot of these are folks that you're going to live with or live next to for probably a long period of time. And so in a property dispute, a lot of times it just becomes cooler heads. I would honestly say it's probably a little bit different than in a personal injury context where you're always going up against, very commonly going up against an insurance carrier, which is almost usually kind of has a lot more resources than your average person who's been a victim of some kind of injury or something like that. Now, with that said, I would say having the knowledge that comes from talking with a knowledgeable counsel that can advise you on what your rights are, and then taking that to your neighbor saying, hey, I've talked to an attorney, here's what the lines are, here's what the rules are. Now, given what these rules are, what do we want to do? I'm going back to the survey example with the fence being on the wrong side. We can lay out very clearly, all right, look, the fence is on the wrong side. We need to solve this. Now, there's a couple of options. We can do an easement. We can do an acquisition. We can do some kind of other license agreement, something like that, or we can have the fence moved. And I think in that situation, once the neighbors kind of have all the tools at their disposal, at that point, once they come up with a resolution, I would have no problem with them coming back to me saying, hey, here's what we've agreed to do. The encroaching property is going to get an easement. Brandon, please draft us an easement agreement. We'll get that signed and recorded, and this will never be a problem again. And so it's a little bit of a mixture of both when it's in the real property context.
And I would say in our line of work sometimes, we meet with a lot of clients or prospective clients, and we don't necessarily take every single case, but there is a lot of times where we can give people a lot of useful information without actually them becoming a client. And if they're informed, they can use that knowledge to, whether it's resolve the property damage claim, to understand why they still owe money on their loan when their vehicle is totaled, or any number of things. So I think that is very helpful to just, when you have a legal issue, most of the time it helps to speak with an attorney, yes, even if you don't actually hire one.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and because I feel like once people get the knowledge and they have the understanding, it helps in this civil context where it's neighbor v. neighbor, where emotions don't get as much of part of it. And that's when I see things kind of spiral out of control, is when it becomes really just an emotional battle, and it becomes much more than a fence line dispute. It's I have to win and you have to lose. But when you talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about and can fully advise you on your rights, and then you go back and say, all right, neighbor, let's get along. I'm going to live here for a long time. So are you. Let's figure out a way to make this work together. That seems to be a better long-term solution.